Good morning. Um, this is your Empress, your Queen, and everything in between, the HBIC, Kiki. And today is the 21st anniversary of the 9/11 tragedy, terrorist attacks. This is the day the towers fell, and almost 3,000 people lost their lives. Um, If this is a touchy subject to people, I am sorry. Um, I will be discussing what happened from my perspective that day, because the question is always asked, where were you that day? Do you remember what you did that day? And a lot of us can't forget what we were doing on that day, because when the attacks happened, the world stood still. It was a horrible, horrible day. People could not believe that this was happening. This had to be a dream, right? No. That was also a day where America felt at its most vulnerable. These attacks were horrific, and some say preventable, but I wouldn't say they were preventable. I would also like to offer my condolences, offer my support, and my salute to the families of those who lost their lives, and to the ones who served during our war on terrorism. Which was one of our wars that lasted over a decade. I remember a month after these tragedies happened, I remember George W. Bush, the president at the time, he declared war. He wanted to destroy Al Qaeda. And this was also when he began the Department of Homeland Security. Now, back to the question of where was someone that day. I would like to offer my story as to where I was during this tragic time. I was going to be 10 years old. It was 7 days before my birthday. Well, it is 7 days before my birthday. Um, but there wasn't much celebrating that year because of this tragedy. It's like it's like no one could possibly function after those attacks because everybody was still in shock. Now, of course, me being a child, I was at school at the time that the towers were hit. And everything just came to a screeching halt when my fifth grade teacher, Mr. Young, he he called for our attention, but it wasn't like, "Hey kids," you know, and we weren't too loud um at the time cuz we were doing an assignment, but he called for our attention. He's like, "Class, I need to tell you something. The World Trade Center has been hit by two planes in New York City." And I think we were dismissed early that day, if I recall correctly, because everybody wanted to be with their families and such. I did not see the footage until um, a couple weeks later when I was visiting my grandparents. And me being, a 9-year-old kid, well, 10-year-old kid by now, I did not know. It's kind of funny, but it's also not funny at the same time because how I felt. Um, my heart dropped because the relation of the state of New York was my cousin and my aunt and uncles. And I did not know the difference in geography of how far my cousin's hometown was. So I was terrified. I because I associated New York with my family, and you know, I didn't know how far New York City was between Buffalo and there. So I assumed it was closer by, and I was crying and asking my grandma to please call my cousin and call Aunt Michelle to see if they're all right. And my grandma looks at me strangely. She's like, "Why, hun?" And I'm like, "Did you see what just happened?" I'm like, "What if Aaron was there?" And she's like, "Sweetie, Buffalo is miles away from New York City. It's not even close to there. In fact, it's a bit farther north." And when we actually looked at a map together, my grandparents, pointed to where my cousin lived and pointed to where New York City was. And I'm like, "But you sure she'll be okay though?" So my grandma calls Aunt Michelle, and, you know, of course she's all right and stuff like that. But me not knowing anything, my heart dropped. I'm like, what if my aunt and my cousins were there? I just, New York and New York City felt like the same entity to me. And I just wanted to make sure my family was safe and nowhere near the towers. But of course they weren't because they're farther north. No, this was a time where I didn't know where New York City really was at the time. I thought it was more in state, um, but yeah. And well, that's where I was on that horrible, horrible day. To be honest, I still, my stomach still drops looking at photos or any footage or even old movies with the two towers shown in there are just somber for me. Like, I cannot view what was the World Trade Center and not feel my heartache. And even with new towers built, the One World Trade Center, ground zero will always be ground zero. And we've gone through a lot as a country, but looking at how things were, people were starting to become more divided. People's definition of unity basically turned into witch hunts against people who are of a different faith, who happen to be of the same faith as the terrorists, but more an extreme manner. Now, let me make something perfectly clear. Those bastards that took those lives, that hijacked those planes, they were not, they, their religion had nothing to do with what they did. They knew what they were gonna do. I don't care if it was for, dying for God or whatever. Find an idiotic reason, to be honest. Yeah, wouldn't want to be around during the Crusades, but still, that is a idiot reason to destroy innocent people. And the former leader of Al Qaeda is dead, thanks to the Navy SEALs. But it took a long ass time to find him. But doesn't mean they're not going to be still active. But people didn't seem to care at the time and still try to discriminate against people that were from the Middle East. And when I was 12, I I knew this boy. I forgot what his name was. He was Sunni Muslim, and a few kids were picking on him, calling him terrorists and all that other stuff. And I stood up for him. Like, that's not what their religion is about. Yeah, dying in the glory of God is partly what it is, but it, it isn't what the terrorists meant. You weren't supposed to die before your time comes. And if you were to die in the glory of his name, supposedly, it would be during a battle, not taking the coward's way out and killing, murdering a bunch of people on a suicide mission. Excuse me. I never understood suicide bombers or suicidal terrorists. Like, do they really have nothing to lose for them to commit such a horrible, horrible crime? Was there nothing left for them? I'm not sympathizing with them. I'm just baffled at how someone is okay with doing such a horrible thing. Almost 3,000 people lost their lives. And for what? For the glory of God? Allah? That's fucking ridiculous. Now, I'm not a major person of faith anymore. Well, I wasn't major in faith anyways, but I pretty much, I wouldn't say I'm atheist, but I pretty much lost faith of there being a real God that's existed. Because what kind of God would allow such horrible things to happen to innocent people? That's why I am not of that faith anymore. After my cousin's murder, it was set in stone for me that there was no God, at least not in my life. But that's a topic for some other time. Back to what I was saying about the terrorists. Like, the leaders did not give a damn about the people that were sacrificing themselves in the glory of God. People did not care. And it was evident that, you know, psychologically, these guys are already fucked in the head to where they're a danger to themselves as well as other people. Such as is when it comes to tragedies. And I can tell you this much. Remembering that day I wish that day never came. I wish the world didn't come to a standstill because these bastards decided to attack my home country. I will never understand that. And I will never forgive those bastards who took those lives. I don't believe in this God forgives everyone BS. Like I said, I lost my faith years ago. And the world is just a shitty place right now. And people wonder why I stick with the goth aesthetic. It's not merely for aesthetic, it's basically how I view life. Black and gray. With some hints of color. I am glad that the country can move forward after these attacks. But domestic terrorism is becoming more of a thing in my country. Again, a topic for another time, if I feel like discussing it. I'm not offering any chance for political backlash because politics do not matter to me when it comes to just being a decent human fucking being. If we treated each other like human beings, none of this stuff would happen. Period. Almost 3,000 families lost someone they love. Almost 3,000 families had to watch those horrible videos, that horrible footage of firemen trying to go in and save everyone. Almost 3,000 families had to watch as some of them committed suicide by jumping from the highest points of the tower because they had no way out. People had to watch that. And people that were close by that filmed that, bless them. Because that was a horrifying thing to watch. It was awful. Like, you will want to believe that something like that wasn't real, but it is. And I am so sorry for New York City that happened to them. That was one of our, the World Trade Center was one of our proudest feats of architecture. They were tallest buildings in the world, even. Excuse me. But people had to tear it down. People had to say, your lives aren't worth it. You don't deserve to live. It's forever embedded into our minds. And it wasn't meant to happen, but it did. Things like this are not supposed to happen, but it did. And we're still fighting terrorism in the Middle East, at home. People just want their lives to have some form of normalcy without hearing about us having to go to war or another country attacking our allies or anything like that. Or playing Mexican standoff with nukes. That's like the worst fear people have. That our leaders have, as a matter of fact. Ooh. But like I said, the terrorists don't give a damn. They never gave a damn. And the destruction of the two towers, part of the Pentagon, it shows that they did not give a damn. Lives were taken. And these guys had no remorse for what they have done. They thought this through and they carried out with it. And for what? Going to heaven early? It's just, it's unbelievable. It's, it's tragic. So, as dis- as discussion, I would like to offer a time to talk about where you were during the 9/11 attacks. Were you a child? Were you just born? Were you in school? Were you at work? Did you have family there that you were so desperately trying to reach? Were you one of the ones that got that terrible phone call that your loved one is gone? These are all questions that can be answered by only you. Only you know what happened to you during that day. To be honest, I can't believe that it was 21 years ago today that such a such a tragedy happened. There were so many soldiers that lost their lives too. So many. Some of them were barely out of high school when they went into combat. And it was heartbreaking. All these men and women losing their lives because of what some bastards did to us. They made our nation feel vulnerable. What was once a belief of having an iron wall has been shattered to pieces. We now know that America is not an iron wall. We are not untouchable. We're just as vulnerable as every other country around the world. It is simply not fair for people to go through what they did. But I can promise you one thing. Terrorist organizations are still going to exist even after we die. But that doesn't mean we can't destroy some of them completely. I don't really know what to say about this much more, besides repeating myself, reiterating that this was terrible. Um, I am making tribute art to this day, and I will be showing it tonight during my evening art segment. I'm not going to show it during my morning segment. I'm too tired for that. Well, that has changed since then. And all I can do is offer sympathy and hope that people's lives have gotten better. Just because your life gets better doesn't mean you're being selfish or forgetting. We will never forget as a country. For those of us who were there, who were out and about that day, we will never forget what they did to us. And we will never forget those people lost. But for the sake of our own well-beings, we have to keep moving. Like I said, just because you decide to move forward in spite of this tragedy happening, whether it be in your family, your friends, or whoever, or somebody who's gone off to war, I can only say that it doesn't make you a bad person. You still remember, but you just want to move forward. And hold close the ones that you cherish. And don't take time for granted. It'll make you happy, it'll make you regret, it'll break you. That's what time does. But time does not define us either. With that being said, I am going to log off for now. I will return this evening. Well, tonight actually. And for my evening segment. And I will show my art. So, with that being said, we never forget. We will always remember. This has been your Empress, your Queen, and everything in between. The HBIC Kiki. And see you tonight for my evening segment. Bye-bye.